Hey guys, welcome to the channel. Tonight we're stepping into one of the quietest, most intense psychological mysteries ever documented. This is the story of two sisters who were so close, they literally became one mind. The question isn't how they shut the world out, but what price they paid to stay together. So before you get completely comfortable, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe, but only if the idea of a deep psychological puzzle is exactly what you need tonight. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's step quietly into the shared mind of the silent twins. March 9th, 93. A van rolls through the Welsh countryside toward Caswell Clinic in Bridgend. Inside, two women sit side by side. Identical twins, 29 years old, finally being transferred from Britain's most notorious psychiatric hospital after 11 years of confinement. Jennifer Gibbons rests her head on her sister June's shoulder. Her eyes are open, but she's not seeing. She's not moving. She's barely breathing. By 6:30 that evening, Jennifer will be dead. Acute myocarditis, the doctors will say. Sudden inflammation of the heart. No drugs in her system. No poison. No explanation. Just a body that decided to stop, as if she'd simply willed herself out of existence. And June, the surviving twin, will do something she hasn't done in nearly 30 years. She'll speak, not just to her sister, not in their secret language, not in whispered fragments behind closed doors. She'll speak to everyone, clearly, confidently, as if she'd been doing it her entire life. "I'm free at last," she'll tell journalist Marjorie Wallace days later. "Liberated. At last, Jennifer has given up her life for me." Two girls who spoke to no one but each other for 3 decades. Two girls who moved in perfect synchronization, who felt each other's pain, who couldn't be separated without going catatonic. Two girls who loved each other with a ferocity that bordered on madness and hated each other with a violence that left scars. Two girls who made a pact that one had to die so the other could live. How did they reach this point? What drove them into silence? And what really happened on that van ride to Bridgend? This is the story of June and Jennifer Gibbons, the silent twins, and it's a story that starts long before they stop speaking, in a place thousands of miles from Wales, on a military base in the Arabian desert. Chapter 1. The Unbreakable Silence. June and Jennifer Gibbons were born on April 11th, 1963, in a military hospital in Aden, Yemen, to Gloria and Aubrey Gibbons, who hailed from the Caribbean island of Barbados. Their father, Aubrey, was a technician serving in the Royal Air Force. Their arrival into the world was unremarkable, though perhaps it was the very proximity of their birth, a mere 10 minutes separating them, that began the complex weaving of their shared destiny. The twins were by all accounts bright, beautiful, and initially perfectly normal children. They were part of a close-knit, loving family unit that included an older sister, Greta, and a younger brother, David. The Gibbons family moved frequently due to Aubrey's service, a constant flux that is critical to understanding the eventual rigidity of the twins' internal world. In 1974, the family settled permanently in the sleepy, mostly white town of Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire, Wales. The move from the cosmopolitan, multiracial environment of a military base to the insular, rural setting of Wales was the first systemic shock to the girls' developing personalities. It is impossible to overstate the importance of this geographical and cultural transplantation. The Gibbons family, one of the few black families in the area, experienced an immediate and persistent layer of social alienation. It began subtly, with the averted glances and the playground whisperings. For the twins, who were naturally shy, the combination of being new and being racially distinct created an immediate, tangible wall between them and their peers. While other children found comfort in assimilation and friendship, June and Jennifer found comfort only in each other. This is the first critical decision point in the story. Faced with a world that felt hostile and incomprehensible, they began to systematically retreat. Their language, which had once been a means of communication with the outside world, began to change. They spoke less to their parents and siblings, and more to each other, a secretive, hushed dialect that outsiders could not penetrate. This was the genesis of what would later be medically defined as cryptophasia, or twin talk, a language shared only between them. The sounds became faster, the cadence more sing-song, the syntax entirely their own. It was a language designed not to inform, but to exclude. The process of external withdrawal was methodical. By the age of 5, they had already begun to move with a strange synchronous grace, turning their heads at the same instant, taking steps that mirrored each other precisely. It was a dance of absolute, unnerving synchronicity. When they were forced to attend school, the external pressure only intensified their internal bond. They were teased mercilessly. Children would chant their names in cruel rhymes, mimicking their strange, high-pitched voices and their shared movement. This persecution was the final devastating catalyst. At the age of 8, June and Jennifer Gibbons made an unspoken pact. They simply stopped talking to the outside world. It was an act of supreme psychological defiance, an internal strike against an unkind universe. They would communicate only with each other, and their interactions with teachers, classmates, and even their own family became reduced to nods, shrugs, and the occasional, almost physically painful utterance. This was not a physical inability to speak. It was a choice, a declaration of psychological secession. When teachers attempted to separate them in an effort to break the pattern, the results were catastrophic. Placing them in separate classrooms resulted in one twin immediately becoming catatonic, a state of psychological and physical paralysis that would only be broken by the sight of her sister. The other would fall into a state of deep, agitated distress, physically rocking back and forth until the separation was ended. The educational authorities, faced with this unprecedented and unyielding resistance, eventually succumbed. They were allowed to sit side by side again, two silent sentinels observing the chaos of the outside world, their hands perpetually intertwined. The scene, two identical girls, utterly silent, moving in perfect unison against a backdrop of normal, noisy childhood, became the enduring image of their early years. Yet, beneath the calm, frozen surface of this shared silence, a terrifying internal dynamic was already beginning to ferment. The world had pushed them together, but in that claustrophobic space of two, a struggle for dominance was starting. The unbreakable silence, the wall against the world, was also a shared prison, and neither twin possessed the key to their own escape. The seeds of the final devastating event had been sown in the quiet terror of their shared childhood exile. This silence was not peace, it was the prelude to war. The doctors who examined them simply called it its elective mutism, a sterile term for a profound human tragedy. We can infer that they did not yet grasp that this was a shared cult of two, a psychic union that was already demanding its own grotesque sacrifices. Chapter 2. The Shared World, Cryptophasia and Obsession. The phenomenon of the silent twins' language, or the lack thereof, is perhaps the most captivating and disturbing element of their early story, and it is here that the mystery of their shared consciousness truly deepens. Their retreat was not into a void, but into a meticulously constructed, highly specific alternative universe articulated through their private whispered code, the Cryptophasia. This wasn't merely baby talk that lingered. It was an evolutionary leap in shared linguistic intimacy. It was a rapid, high-pitched vocalization, a torrent of sound where syntax was bent, words were truncated, and meaning was entirely dependent on context and the shared psychological history only they possessed. An outsider could stand next to them and hear only a buzzing, unintelligible murmur. But to the girls, it was a language capable of expressing profound love, seething hatred, and complex narrative. It was the absolute final boundary of their shared identity. The creation of this shared language is crucial because it acted as the central nervous system of their codependency. Psychologically, this phenomenon is rare, but usually temporary. In the case of the Gibbons, it became the permanent, defining feature of their communication. It was a shared script for a play with only 2 actors, performed for an audience of none. The complexity of this bond goes far beyond simple shyness or sibling closeness. It speaks to a deliberate, almost ritualistic rejection of any external reference point. They didn't need the world's words because they had their own. They didn't need the world's validation because they had each other's. This level of mutual validation became a dangerous, closed loop, reinforcing every shared delusion and amplifying every joint insecurity. The silence was the symptom. The cryptophasia was the terrifying, intricate disease. The psychological context for this development is complex and multi-layered. The initial trauma of social rejection, the bullying and the racial isolation in Haverfordwest provided the external pressure, but the internal predisposition lay in the very nature of identical twins. Studies on twin dynamics often point to the risk of identity diffusion, where the need for individual selfhood is submerged into the convenience and safety of the twin unit. For June and Jennifer, this process was taken to an extreme. They consciously cultivated their difference from the world by cultivating their terrifying sameness with each other. They wore the same clothes, moved the same way, and most importantly, spoke the same secret language. They became, for all practical purposes, a single, two-bodied organism. The teachers and mental health professionals who attempted to intervene during this period were utterly baffled. They tried to separate them, which only provoked catatonic terror. They tried to communicate, but the girls simply stared back with an unnerving, blank resistance. Their resistance was not passive, it was active and powerful. They were not unable to speak, they were unwilling to speak the language of their persecutors. In their shared bedroom, which became the central location of the next phase of their lives, this shared world flourished. By the time they reached their teenage years, the bedroom was less a place of rest and more a sacred, hermetically sealed temple of 2. They spent almost every waking hour together, meticulously crafting their internal narratives. They played with paper dolls, constructing intricate, years-long soap operas. They filled their diaries, volumes upon volumes, of tiny, meticulous handwriting, which would later become the most important and horrifying window into their minds. These diaries were not merely records of events. They were a battleground. Because they refused to speak to anyone else, their entire torrent of emotion, their deep-seated resentments, and their intense possessive love were all poured out onto the page. But even in this private medium, the struggle for identity was fierce. The diaries are often written with competing perspectives, detailing the same event but filtered through different layers of bitter grievance. June's writing, often more focused on external observation and a longing for fame and normal life, would describe Jennifer with a brutal, almost surgical detachment. She wrote, "My sister is a wolf, a golden girl. I hate her. She is eating my soul. There is a sweetness about her, but she is destroying me. She kills me slowly by making me silent." Jennifer, often the more dominant and perhaps more purely introverted of the 2, would write back with equal parts venom and fear. She wrote, "I wish I could smash her face in, crack her head open and drink her blood." Yet, in the next sentence, she might write, "I love June, my dearest precious twin. Without her, I am nothing. We are one." This extreme emotional oscillation, from murderous hatred to desperate codependency, reveals the true nature of their silence. The silence protected them from the world, but it trapped them with each other. It magnified every small conflict into an existential crisis. If one of them achieved a small victory, a good grade on a test, a moment of independent action, the other would immediately respond with a jealous, crushing act of psychological warfare to re-establish the balance of their shared fate. Their silence was the vessel, but their deep, toxic love-hate relationship was the corrosive liquid inside, slowly eating away at the foundations of their individual selves. The stage was now set for the next phase, where this intense internal world would be externalized through the only other medium they felt they could control: literature. They would attempt to speak, not with their voices, but with their pens, hoping to break the silence and achieve the fame they craved, a craving that was destined to fail catastrophically and lead to their first major confrontation with the brutal reality of the world they had shunned. The irony is tragic. They became silent to escape the world, but their silence made the world impossible to ignore. The mechanism of folie à deux, expanding the shared delusion. To fully grasp the magnitude of their shared psychological landscape, we must delve into the specific mechanics of the clinical condition that most closely described their shared madness: folie à deux, or shared delusional disorder. This condition is defined by the transmission of a delusional belief from one person, the inducer or primary, to another, the recipient or secondary, often within the context of a long-term intimate relationship. In the case of the Gibbons, this dynamic was warped by their identical twinship. We can interpret this as not a simple transmission of a delusion, but a co-creation of a shared, toxic reality where the delusion was not that the outside world was hostile, which was partially true, but that only the two of them existed. Everyone else was a threatening phantom, and the greatest threat of all was the idea of individuality. The dynamics of dominance were constantly shifting. At various times, June would take the lead, only to be violently deposed by Jennifer. Based on what we can infer from the patterns of folie à deux, it suggests that Jennifer, being born 10 minutes later, was perpetually struggling with the psychological reality of being the second, fueling her need to assert absolute, possessive control over June's entire existence. Conversely, June's yearning for separation was countered by a profound, deep-seated guilt and physical inability to function without her sister's presence. The very definition of their shared existence was a constant, exhausting tug-of-war where the rope was the integrity of their own soul. This complex psychological relationship led to a series of shared rituals and compulsions that further cemented their exclusion. Beyond the synchronized walking and the cryptophasia, they developed strange, almost ceremonial rules for interaction. They would often take turns being active and passive for periods of time. If one ate, the other might refuse. If one spoke a phrase to their mother, the other would immediately repeat it, as if correcting the minor dissonance of an individual action. When they finally started writing, they established a rule that one must receive the typewriter before the other could begin, turning the very act of creation into a moment of ritualistic, shared tension. The ultimate sign of the folie à deux was the extent of their shared sensory world. Reports from their family indicated that if one twin was injured, the other would sometimes experience a psychosomatic echo of the pain. If one twin was sent to a different room, the other would immediately slump into a state of semi-catatonia, unable to process the external world without the immediate physical proximity of her reflection. Their shared existence was not merely a choice, it had become a neurological necessity, and the silent language was the wire transmitting the life support signal between them. The doctors who tried to break this bond in their teens faced a wall of such psychological force that it often led to despair. One attempt involved recording the twins' rapid-fire cryptophasia and playing it back to them, hoping to show them how bizarre and unintelligible their private world sounded to others. The twins' reaction was not shame or realization, but profound, silent, synchronized amusement. The private language was not a broken form of English. Based on its utility, we can infer it was a perfect language for the two people it was designed to serve, and the world's incomprehension was merely confirmation of its perfection. The absolute non-negotiable nature of their silence in the presence of others transformed their entire existence into a performance of defiance. It solidified the external perception of them as strange, unreachable, and ultimately dangerous. The silent refusal was the final devastating tool of the folie à deux, a deliberate act to ensure that no external truth, no compassionate word, and no therapeutic attempt could ever penetrate the impenetrable barrier of their shared reality. This was the dark crucible where their literary ambition would be forged, an ambition rooted in the desperate need to communicate their inner turmoil without ever having to surrender their protective silence. They were searching for a voice that could be heard by millions, yet spoken only by two. Chapter 3. The Adolescent Dream, Literature and Isolation. The transition from silent girls to obsessive writers marked a pivotal and ultimately doomed attempt to break free from the invisible chains of their codependency without physically separating. From their mid-teens, the Gibbons twins retreated almost entirely into their shared bedroom, which quickly transformed from a place of sanctuary into a kind of creative, literary sweatshop. The outside world had proven too harsh, too confusing, too judgmental. They decided the only reality worth engaging with was the one they could meticulously control on paper. This period, from roughly the age of 16 to 19, is characterized by an almost unimaginable level of self-imposed discipline and obsessive output. Their isolation was nearly complete. They lived under a rigid, self-imposed timetable. They would spend hours crafting intricate plots, typing furiously on an old borrowed typewriter, and, most crucially, pouring their most violent, secret thoughts into their small, leather-bound diaries. They subsisted largely on canned soup, toast, and whatever their parents could cajole them into eating. The entire family was forced to orbit around this strange, silent, self-sustaining world of the twins' creation. The scale of their literary ambition was staggering. They didn't merely write short stories, they wrote full-length, deeply complex novels, often simultaneously. They created a joint pact or contract, a shared commitment to achieving literary fame. This contract stipulated that they must write every day, and that their success would be a joint venture, one twin's fame reflecting entirely upon the other. This pact, while fueling their creativity, was another mechanism for control, ensuring that neither could succeed without the other. June's most noted novel was The Pepsi Cola Addict, a deeply troubled, semi-autobiographical story centered on a delinquent doctor who attempts to woo a nurse but is convicted of rape and sent to a correctional facility. The story is a torrent of teenage angst, sexual confusion, and a fascination with violence and crime that mirrored the internal chaos of their own lives. Her writing style was more direct, focusing on dialogue and plot, often infused with a yearning for normal life, the very life she and her sister had deliberately excluded themselves from. Jennifer's work, such as The Pony Trekker and Discomania, often showcased a darker, more purely abstract imagination. Her plots were arguably more complex, sometimes veering into the fantastical or the overtly violent. Her writing was more dense, more poetic, and more deeply cynical, reflecting a mind that had entirely given up on the possibility of external happiness. Her characters were often victims of bizarre and senseless acts of cruelty, and her narratives frequently ended in tragedy, violence, or complete self-destruction. In one of her chilling poems, she describes herself as a death row prisoner and her sister as her executioner. The sheer volume of this output is what makes this period so fascinating. They produced a library of work, novels, hundreds of poems, and thousands of pages of diary entries, all detailing the minutiae of their shared existence and the explosive, often murderous thoughts they had about each other. They would read each other's work and offer brutal, unsparing critiques. This was their new form of cryptophasia. They were now communicating through the coded language of fiction, using their characters as avatars for their own shared resentments. The protagonist of June's novel, for instance, was widely seen by the twins themselves as a surrogate for Jennifer, an attempt by June to publicly dissect and expose her twin's darker psyche. Their attempts to publish this work, however, brought them into catastrophic contact with the outside world they had so carefully walled off. They painstakingly typed their manuscripts and sent them out to numerous publishers. The responses were uniformly disheartening. Rejections. Their work was too raw, too dark, too strange for mainstream publication. Their dreams of escaping the silence through literary fame were repeatedly, cruelly dashed. The psychological consequence of these rejections was devastating. The literary world, the one external system they had chosen to engage with, had rejected their carefully constructed, shared identity. It confirmed their original, deep-seated belief the world was a hostile place that did not want them. This failure amplified the inherent cruelty of their bond. If they could not be famous together, they would be infamous together. The only thing left was to fully embrace the chaos they wrote about. The diary entries during this time became even more violent, marking a clear escalation from psychological warfare to clear, stated intent. They began to detail their contracts of hatred, their desperate efforts to destroy the other. June wrote, "I am desperately unhappy. Someone is killing me, slowly, and I am not strong enough to stop them." Jennifer wrote, "We decided to be silent and stick to the contract. We have broken that contract, and now we must pay the price." This shared failure was the direct catalyst for the next, most destructive phase of their lives. The pen had failed to liberate them. Now they would turn to fire. The intricate, controlled world of the bedroom, filled with the ghosts of their fictional characters, was about to be abandoned for the real, uncontrolled violence of the streets. The silence had not only amplified their creativity, it had also distilled their fury, preparing them for an eruption that would finally force the world to pay attention. The walls of their fortress were coming down, and the fire would ensure they took their literary failures out into the public eye, achieving infamy where they could not achieve fame. The rejection of their novels, the betrayal of their joint pact, and the devastating violence of their physical fights all converged into a final, suicidal impulse to drag the whole world into the suffocating, fiery darkness of their shared consciousness. Detailed thematic analysis of the Gibbons fiction. To understand the sheer magnitude of their internal struggle, we must go beyond merely naming their novels and analyse the dark, prophetic themes that saturated their fiction. Their writing was not merely a hobby. We can consider it a high-fidelity transcript of the murder-suicide pact that was playing out in their minds. June's The Pepsi Cola Addict. The novel, which June managed to self-publish with a small independent vanity press that quickly went defunct, is a raw, explosive narrative set in the fictional world of a Californian correctional facility. The protagonist, Preston, is a young, volatile doctor from Wales who falls into a life of crime and sexual deviance. The plot is less important than the psychological portrait of Preston. He is a character consumed by addiction and a desperate search for validation, mirroring June's own external desires. The book's central themes are confinement and escape. Preston is constantly trying to break free from psychological and physical confinement, reflecting June's profound desire to escape the confines of her sister's codependency. The escape always ends in deeper failure, which we can interpret as an early cognitive resignation to their shared fate. Sexual and emotional confusion. The narrative is laced with awkward, violent, and highly confused sexual encounters, demonstrating the twins' total lack of normal social interaction and their desperate, distorted understanding of adult intimacy. The addiction to destruction. Preston's Pepsi Cola addiction is a clear metaphor for the uncontrollable, destructive compulsion that drove the twins. The addiction is the only thing that gives his life meaning, much like their shared pathology gave them meaning. June's dedication to this novel, a desperate attempt to find an audience for her pain, was rooted in the idea of the external rescue. Her protagonist was always looking outside for salvation. A woman, a drug, a new location. This contrasts sharply with Jennifer's internal, nihilistic approach. Jennifer's dyscomania. Jennifer's work, which remains largely unpublished, was far more abstract, violent, and cynical. Dyscomania is a sprawling, almost hallucinatory narrative about a young dancer who is dragged into a world of violent crime and is ultimately destroyed by forces beyond her control. The themes are nihilism and fatalism. Jennifer's characters do not seek rescue, they accept their doom. They are victims of bizarre, random cruelties. The choice of such protagonists could be seen as an externalized portrait of Jennifer's belief that the world was an irredeemably hostile place and that resistance was futile. Possession and parasitism. Many of Jennifer's characters are consumed by parasites or external forces that take over their will. This is a clear projection of her internal life, where she often viewed June as a parasite feeding off her identity, or perhaps viewed their shared identity as the parasite feeding off both of them. The acceptance of death. Unlike June's characters who fight to live, Jennifer's characters often welcome their violent ends. This literary fatalism chillingly preempted her eventual decision to sacrifice herself, allowing us to assume she viewed death not as a tragedy, but as a release. The twins' diaries acted as a simultaneous critique and fueling station for this fiction. They would write about each other using the language of their novels. June once wrote about Jennifer, calling her the evil companion and predicting, "One of us will die and the other will be free." Jennifer, writing about June, used the term sledgehammer to describe the destructive force of her sister's ambition to separate. When these powerful, violent narratives were rejected by the outside world, the internal pressure became critical. The thousands of pages of creative energy, the bottled-up violence, and the desperate yearning for notoriety, having been denied an outlet on paper, were forced back inside the fortress of their shared mind. The failure of the literary dream was the final, non-negotiable proof that the world did not care about their thoughts or their art. If they could not be acknowledged as artists, they would be acknowledged as monsters. The move to arson was the inevitable, fiery conclusion of their failed aesthetic project. They traded the ink-stained world of their bedroom for the raw, terrifying reality of fire, hoping the flames would finally communicate the depth of their desperation. Chapter 4. The Breakaway Attempt and Shared Betrayal. The creative failure, the repeated rejection of their novels, served as the breaking point for the delicate, toxic equilibrium of their shared identity. The literary pact was predicated on joint success. When that success failed to materialise, the pact mutated into something darker, a desperate, destructive need to separate. The twins had been one for so long that the idea of genuine individuality was terrifying, but the pressure of their shared hatred had become unbearable. They began to realise, in the deep recesses of their isolated minds, that their bond was not strength, but a cage built for two. The first, tentative, and ultimately catastrophic attempt at separation involved a male figure, an external variable they had never before introduced into their closed system. Around the age of 19, living on unemployment benefits and deeply restless, June and Jennifer began to tentatively interact with the local youth, frequenting a youth centre in Haverfordwest. It was here that they encountered a young man, a local boy who, surprisingly, seemed to be interested in both of them. His name has been withheld from much of the reporting, but his existence represents the single greatest threat to the twins' codependent system, and his introduction led to the first act of profound mutual betrayal. Initially, the interaction was a source of nervous excitement. For the first time, they were receiving attention from a source that was not a family member, a teacher, or a baffled psychologist. It was a glimmer of the normal, independent life June, in particular, often wrote about. The interactions were strange and constrained. The twins would often stand on either side of the boy, whispering their cryptophasia to each other, even while he was present, using their private language to comment on his behaviour, his looks and his conversation. The boy, perhaps intrigued by the mystery or simply naive to the complex psychological warfare taking place, continued to engage. What followed was a slow, agonising power struggle over this single, external focus of affection. Both twins, in their secret diaries, started recording their own individual claims on his time and attention. June began to see him more often alone, attempting to establish a relationship outside the suffocating orbit of her sister. Jennifer, whose diary entries reveal an intense jealous fury at this perceived desertion, responded with a level of possessiveness that bordered on psychosis. For Jennifer, June's attempt at an independent life was not just a rejection, it was an act of existential annihilation. If June could exist without her, then who was Jennifer? The psychological mechanism at play here is key to understanding the subsequent violence. Their relationship was built on mutual mirror imaging. Every time June tried to step out of the shared reflection, Jennifer would deploy every tool in their shared psychological arsenal to pull her back in. The tactics ranged from subtle emotional manipulation, sulking for days, refusing to communicate, even in cryptophasia, to outright physical violence. The private, contained war of words in the diaries now became a very real physical conflict. They began to fight with a shocking, desperate brutality. They would choke each other until they lost consciousness. They would strike each other with heavy objects. These fights were not mere sibling squabbles. They were battles for the very right to exist independently. A small, seemingly insignificant fight over a pen or a notebook could instantly escalate into a life and death struggle. Their parents, Gloria and Aubrey, would often discover them in their room, locked in a ferocious embrace of violence, with deep bruises and bleeding wounds. When separated, they would immediately revert to their silent, synchronized state, staring blankly ahead, refusing to explain the source of the injury. They were bound by the violence as much as by the love. This cycle of violence was amplified by their shared poverty and idleness. With no education and no independent skills, they had no means to escape Haverfordwest, no way to find jobs that would logically necessitate separation. Their lives were a perfect storm of enforced proximity, extreme emotional intensity, and absolute lack of external anchor. The attempt at an independent relationship with the boy was the last, desperate throw of the dice for June to break free. When that relationship inevitably failed, perhaps because the boy realised the impossibility of being with one twin without the other's total, hostile presence, the resulting collapse of hope was total. The disappointment and the renewed realisation that their shared identity was unbreakable led to a final mutual decision. If they could not achieve a separate successful life, they would achieve a joint spectacular failure. They consciously and deliberately decided to become notorious. The failure to publish their works now transitioned into a desire to make their lives the scandalous, unforgettable narrative. They began to experiment with drugs and alcohol, attempting to chemically alter the impossible clarity of their shared mind. The idleness and the psychological pressure created a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushed the impulse for destruction. This phase is defined by the absolute erosion of the final moral boundaries. The internal hatred for each other was now externalized into a hatred for the society that had failed to accept them. The stage was set for the criminal spree, which was less an act of genuine criminality and more a highly ritualized, destructive expression of their profound psychological distress. The failure to write themselves into fame resulted in the decision to burn their way into infamy. The rejection of their novels, the betrayal of their joint pact, and the devastating violence of their physical fights all converged into a final suicidal impulse to drag the whole world into the suffocating, fiery darkness of their shared consciousness. The silence was over. The screams were about to begin, translated into the language of police reports and arson investigations. Chapter 5. The Descent into Crime, Chaos and Destruction. Following the disintegration of their literary ambitions and the failure of June's attempt at an external relationship, the twins' shared life entered its most destructive and public phase. The descent into a spree of petty crime, vandalism, and ultimately arson. This was not a calculated shift into professional criminality. Rather, it was a dramatic, impulsive, and highly theatrical expression of their profound psychological distress and their final, desperate need to be seen, to be heard, and to be stopped. The period began with small, random acts of defiance, shoplifting minor items, breaking windows, minor vandalism, acts that were immediately traceable back to them. Their behaviour in the streets was erratic, often conducted in their unnerving, synchronised manner. They would walk in perfect step, their heads turning in unison, occasionally erupting into bursts of their shared high-pitched cryptophasia. This bizarre behaviour only intensified the social isolation they experienced. But by now, they seemed to crave the reaction, no matter how negative. The crime soon escalated from mere mischief to deliberate, frightening acts of destruction. They began experimenting with fire. Fire in this context was the perfect symbol for their internal state. Chaotic, uncontrollable, and ultimately purifying. It was the absolute final rejection of the written word, the controlled medium that had failed them. The pen was replaced by the flame. The spree of arson that eventually led to their arrest consisted of 5 distinct, serious incidents occurring over a short period of time. Each act was an extension of their shared suicidal impulse, a form of joint externalized self-immolation designed to achieve the notoriety their novels could not. The Playhouse Fire. Their first major act was the destruction of a small shed or playhouse in a local field. This was a relatively minor incident in terms of damage, but psychologically it was the crucial boundary that they crossed, establishing fire as their new language. The Vocational College Attack. This incident was far more serious. They set fire to a building at the local vocational college, where they had briefly and disastrously attempted to enroll in a writing course. This act was deeply symbolic, a violent rejection of the formal education and career path that was forever closed to them. The fire was an act of vengeance against the system that had failed to accommodate their needs and validate their talents. The Tractor Fire. In an act of pure vandalism, they doused a farm tractor in petrol and set it alight. This was a crime of opportunity, a random act of chaos that demonstrated their utter lack of concern for property or consequence. It was pure, raw expression of their internal anarchy. The insurance building, they targeted a small disused office building, an act that felt almost deliberate in its selection. The bureaucratic, impersonal face of the establishment. This fire was set with a clear understanding of its destructive power, yet no thoughts to the potential consequences for themselves. The fatal attempt. The final act of the spree was the most frightening. They attempted to set fire to a local farm in which people were sleeping. This incident was the true point of no return. It elevated their behaviour from mere vandalism to a crime that directly endangered human life. Throughout this period, their internal conflict intensified. They would egg each other on, daring the other to commit more brazen and destructive acts. Yet immediately after the crime, the internal war would resume. The shared thrill of the destruction would quickly give way to intense recrimination, with each twin blaming the other for the risk taken, the fear experienced, and the inevitable consequences looming over them. The police investigation was swift, given the extremely small pool of suspects capable of such synchronized and bizarre behavior in a small town. The Gibbons twins were immediately suspects. They were picked up by the police near the scene of the fifth fire. Their arrest was as strange as their crimes. They remained utterly silent, communicating only their high-pitched cryptophasia to each other, baffling the officers attempting to take their statements. The police were forced to rely entirely on the vast, detailed evidence of the twins' own writing. The diaries seized during the investigation became the most damning and compelling evidence against them. They contained, in June's meticulous handwriting and Jennifer's poetic fury, detailed first-person accounts of the arson attacks, the emotional motivation, and the complex, toxic relationship that fueled them. The writing confirmed what the police suspected. The crimes were an expression of a profound shared mental illness, a kind of shared delusional disorder, or folie à deux, where the boundary between self and other had entirely dissolved. The content of the diaries was essential. They documented their decision to burn down the town and their strange, chilling internal negotiations about who would take the most blame. This self-incriminating evidence was the perfect summation of their lives. They had failed to communicate with the world through speech. They had failed to communicate through conventional literature. And now, their only successful communication was through a self-written confession, a suicide note for their shared identity, delivered through the medium of police evidence. The court was faced with an extraordinary problem. The evidence for the crimes was undeniable, yet the defendants were clearly suffering from an unprecedented psychological condition. They were not malicious criminals in the conventional sense, but two people trapped in a symbiotic relationship that demanded their destruction. The stage was now set for the trial, which would transform their case from a local crime spree into a national psychological and legal mystery, forcing the justice system to contend with the impossible question of shared culpability in a shared mind. Their silence was about to be put on trial, and the verdict would be indefinite psychological imprisonment. Chapter 6. The Courtroom and the Indefinite Sentence. The trial of June and Jennifer Gibbons in 1982 was not a conventional legal proceeding. It was an intersection of law, psychology, and public fascination. The two defendants, now 19 years old, sat in the dock of the courtroom, an eerie picture of perfect, unnerving synchronicity. They wore identical clothes, sat in the same posture, and remained absolutely silent, communicating only their secret, private language to each other in low, inaudible whispers. A direct challenge to the authority and procedure of the court. The prosecution's case, built on the physical evidence of the arson and the damning, thousands of pages long evidence of their diaries, was overwhelming. The diary entries were read aloud, presenting the court with the twins' raw, unfiltered thoughts of violence, obsession, and self-destruction. The words June's yearning for normalcy and Jennifer's fierce, possessive hatred were shocking in their honesty, painting a picture of an internal war that had finally spilled out into the streets of Haverfordwest. The defence, meanwhile, focused almost entirely on the question of diminished responsibility, arguing that the girls were victims of a complex, shared psychological disorder, the folie à deux, and that their actions were driven by a profound need to break the cycle of their codependency. The courtroom drama centred less on what they did and more on why. The psychiatric testimony was the most pivotal and controversial aspect of the trial. Numerous experts were called, all of whom struggled to classify the Gibbons twins' condition. They were clearly not psychotic in the classical sense, yet their detachment from reality and their profound incapacity for independent function were undeniable. The most devastating diagnosis, and the one that ultimately determined their sentence, was the suggestion of psychopathy. The court was presented with the diagnosis of psychopathy, or antisocial personality disorder, based largely on their lack of remorse, their pattern of destructive behaviour, and their seemingly willful refusal to communicate. This diagnosis was, and remains, highly controversial. A crucial element of psychopathy is often a lack of empathy and an ability to manipulate others. While the Gibbons were certainly destructive, their actions were primarily directed at themselves and their own immediate environment, and their silence was less an act of manipulation and more an act of self-defence and social withdrawal. Nonetheless, the diagnosis of a severe personality disorder capable of great danger was deemed credible by the judge. Faced with the evidence of dangerous, highly destructive behaviour coupled with an unclassifiable psychological disorder, the judge, in his final deliberation, concluded that the twins posed a significant and ongoing danger to the public. He did not issue a fixed-term sentence. Instead, he handed down an indefinite sentence under the Mental Health Act, committing both June and Jennifer to Broadmoor Hospital, one of the UK's highest security psychiatric facilities. The commitment was indefinite, a term that meant they would be held until such time as they were deemed no longer a danger to themselves or others. In practical terms, this could imply a life sentence. The decision was met with a mixture of shock and unease. The public was relieved that the fire-raising twins were off the streets, but there was a profound disquiet about sending two severely codependent young women who had primarily injured themselves and property to an institution designed for serial killers and violent criminals. The sentence was arguably as much an admission of psychiatric failure as it was a judicial ruling. The legal system, unable to understand them, simply removed them from society entirely. The twins' reaction to the verdict was, characteristically, silent and synchronised. There were no tears, no outbursts, only the unnerving, simultaneous turn of their heads. The only communication came later in their diaries, where they expressed a strange, almost relieved acceptance. The world had finally taken notice, and they had achieved the notoriety they had failed to find through literature. They had traded their small, self-imposed prison for the large, external one, and in a twisted way, we can infer it was a validation. The irony of their placement in Broadmoor is profound. The institution was built on the principle of individual therapy and separation, designed to break down the pathological connections that often led to crime. For the Gibbons, the environment of maximum security was initially less terrifying than the complex social dynamics of the outside world. Here, everything was simple, structured, and most importantly, everyone was equally alienated. However, the intention of the staff at Broadmoor was to break the twins' bond. The authorities viewed their codependency as the source of their madness and criminality. Their therapy would be focused on forcing them apart encouraging individual expression, and finally, teaching them to speak to others. This therapeutic goal would put the twins into direct high-stakes conflict with the institution itself, leading to the most profound and dangerous phase of their internal war. Broadmoor was meant to cure them, but it only intensified the fundamental, terrifying truth of their existence. They were a shared entity, and that entity was fundamentally incompatible with life. The struggle for June and Jennifer was not over. It was only now about to begin on a much more tightly controlled, but infinitely more desperate stage, the legal and ethical nightmare of the psychopathy diagnosis. The moment the word psychopathy was introduced into the Gibbons trial, the entire legal context shifted from one of therapeutic need to one of dangerous criminal intent. This diagnostic leap from elective mutism and shared delusional disorder to severe personality disorder is the crucial, ethically questionable pivot of their story. The diagnostic criteria for psychopathy, as defined by figures like Dr. Robert Hare, centre on a pattern of pervasive disregard for the rights of others, a lack of empathy, and manipulative behaviour. While the Gibbons were certainly destructive, their actions rarely fit the classic psychopathic mould. Their arson was impulsive, theatrical, and self-incriminating, the opposite of the calculated, cold-blooded criminality often associated with psychopathy. Crucially, the extreme emotional depth documented in their diaries, the profound love, the searing hatred, the intense fear of separation, demonstrated a rich if toxic internal emotional life, inconsistent with the emotional poverty typical of true psychopathy. The legal outcome, in this context, allows us to consider that the true reason for the psychopathy diagnosis was rooted in the legal system's need to justify the indefinite sentence. Under the UK's Mental Health Act, indefinite detention in a maximum security setting, like Broadmoor, was primarily reserved for individuals deemed both mentally ill and dangerously psychopathic, those whose pathology presented an ongoing, unmanageable risk to the public. If the twins were merely suffering from a profound case of folie à deux and social anxiety, they would have been sent to a medium security therapeutic facility. Given the clinical definition, the judge's reliance on this term suggests their silence became the ultimate evidence of their danger. It was interpreted not as fear or withdrawal, but as cold, calculating non-compliance, a rejection of societal authority and a sign of incorrigible wickedness. The ethical crisis was this: a judicial system, confronted by a psychological phenomenon it could not classify or treat, opted for the most secure containment possible. The judge, in delivering the indefinite sentence, was essentially stating, "We do not know what this is, but it is dangerous, and it must be permanently removed from view." The public reaction was swift and polarised. In Haverfordwest, there was a palpable sense of relief that the community's terror was over. Nationally, however, the press began to ask uncomfortable questions about the severity of the sentence. The image of two young women, seemingly frail and silent, being sent to the same institution as the Yorkshire Ripper and other notorious figures, sparked a fierce debate about the intersection of mental illness and criminality. Their arrival at Broadmoor was a moment of profound psychological trauma. The facility was designed to be terrifying, a final barrier against those deemed unfit for society. The journey itself, the transfer in the secure van, the sights and sounds of the high walls, the razor wire, and the heavily barred windows marked the total collapse of their self-constructed reality. The outside world had finally broken down their door, not with therapy or kindness, but with steel and concrete. When they were first separated and taken to different reception wards, the effect was immediate and dramatic, proving the psychiatric experts' attempts to classify them as simple psychopaths deeply flawed. June instantly became physically ill, vomiting and shaking uncontrollably, her body reacting with a visceral revolt to the removal of her essential other half. Jennifer fell into a profound, inert state, refusing to move or respond, existing only as a still, silent shell. The staff realised almost immediately that the strict regime of separation, while mandated by the theoretical cure, would only result in their imminent physical and psychological demise. The institution designed to break them was forced to immediately compromise its own rules, acknowledging the terrifying, undeniable truth. The twins' destructive bond was also their only mechanism for survival. The fight to break the silence had failed. Now, the fight to survive the silence in a cage of steel and concrete was beginning. Chapter 7. Life in the Asylum, the Internal War. The arrival of June and Jennifer Gibbons at Broadmoor Hospital in 1982 marked the beginning of a 14-year-long incarceration in a world designed for the criminally insane. It was a severe, high-security environment, a stark contrast to the quiet isolation of their Pembrokeshire home. For the first time, the twins were subjected to an unyielding, institutional structure whose primary goal was the complete dismantling of their shared identity. The initial years at Broadmoor, roughly 1982 to 1990, were characterised by the staff's attempts to enforce separation. Psychologists and nurses understood that the twins' folie à deux was the central mechanism of their destructive behaviour. They were assigned to separate wards, miles apart within the complex, and were initially restricted from seeing each other. The expectation was that this enforced solitude would break the spell, forcing them to communicate with staff and begin the process of building individual identities. The results of this enforced separation were immediate, dramatic, and deeply concerning. Placed alone, the twins would become immediately catatonic. June, in particular, would fall into long periods of deep, almost vegetable-like silence, refusing to eat or speak, only coming to life with an almost terrifying intensity when she learned her sister was nearby. Jennifer would respond with violent, self-injurious behaviour, often scratching and clawing at her own face and arms, only calming down when she was assured of her sister's well-being. The institution quickly realised that full separation was not therapeutic. It was an act of psychological torture that threatened their lives. A compromise was reached. The twins were allowed supervised, limited visitation, but always under strict observation, and always with the therapeutic goal of encouraging them to speak to a third party. They remained utterly resistant. During their visits, they would sit side by side, silent for long periods, then launch into their high-speed, high-pitched cryptophasia, entirely excluding the staff observer. Their silence in the presence of others became their ultimate weapon of resistance, a sign that the two-person cult was stronger than the maximum security institution. Within the wards, the internal war raged on, often escalating into serious physical violence. Because they were surrounded by others, their fights took on a new performative quality. They would attack each other with a ferocity that stunned the staff, often resulting in injuries that required medical intervention. The dynamic was always the same: a momentary separation, an attempt by one to engage with a staff member or another patient, followed by a violent, possessive retribution from the other. The Broadmoor environment, rather than diffusing their conflict, simply gave it a high-stakes audience. The diaries, which they continued to keep, remained the only true window into their shared psychological hell. They wrote about the food, the other patients, and the staff, but mostly they wrote about each other. Their entries became increasingly desperate and fatalistic. June, who continued to yearn for an independent, artistic life, wrote about her increasing frustration. "I am trapped. Jennifer is my jailer. We share a cell and a soul. I wish she would die so I could be free." Jennifer, often the more passive-aggressive and manipulative of the two, would retort in her diary, "We are meant to be one. If June leaves me, I will destroy myself and her. A crucial figure emerged during this time, Marjorie Wallace, a Sunday Times journalist who discovered the twins' story and spent years documenting their case, eventually writing the seminal book, The Silent Twins. Wallace began visiting the girls regularly, building a rare, fragile rapport with them. She was one of the few external figures who saw beyond the psychiatric diagnosis to the artistic, thwarted souls underneath. Wallace's visits created an accidental therapeutic outlet. She encouraged them to continue writing, providing them with notebooks and pens. Their communication with Wallace was always mediated, slow and constrained, but through her, the world of the outside was, in a very limited way, allowed back in. It was Wallace who recorded the most chilling details of their internal life and death struggle. The forced regimen of medication further complicated their treatment. They were often heavily sedated in an effort to manage their mood swings and violent outbursts. This, however, dulled their intense creativity and added a layer of sluggishness to their shared existence. The psychological battle was now compounded by a biochemical one, as they struggled to maintain the intense clarity of their codependent bond through the haze of antipsychotics. Around the 10-year mark, a critical change began to occur. The violence lessened, replaced by a profound, pervasive sense of resignation. The endless, desperate war for individual identity had reached a stalemate. Neither could kill the other, and neither could live without the other. This stalemate led to the final, most chilling internal negotiation. A negotiation that was not for separation, but for ultimate, definitive freedom, achievable only through the removal of one twin. This was the dark resolution that would set the stage for the final act of their story, a final chilling contract that would be carried out to the letter upon their release. The silence had now become a quiet, absolute conviction. One of them had to die. Detailed sensory and institutional life at Broadmoor. The atmosphere of Broadmoor Hospital was a psychological amplifier, turning the twins' internal distress into a constant, echoing reality. To understand their transformation, one must visualize the daily reality of their 14-year incarceration. Broadmoor is an imposing Victorian Gothic structure, surrounded by high walls, barbed wire, and meticulous security protocols. The environment was cold, highly regimented, and filled with the low-level, pervasive tension that comes from housing people who have committed terrible crimes. This was the backdrop for June and Jennifer's internal war, the therapeutic failures. The staff attempted a variety of conventional therapeutic approaches, all of which were designed to foster individual identity. Art therapy and occupational therapy. The twins initially resisted, but later used these sessions to subtly undermine each other. They would critique each other's drawings with vicious whispered cryptophasia, or refuse to share materials, turning a communal activity into a subtle battleground. The moment a therapist showed individual praise, the other twin would become sullen and resistive, forcing the staff to revert to treating them as a unit. Individual counselling. This was the most catastrophic failure. Placing one twin alone with a psychiatrist would often result in total catatonia. If a sound was made at all, it was a high-pitched, distressed whine, a frequency designed to reach the other twin's ward. The psychiatrists, often high-ranking professionals who had dealt with extreme violence, were rendered powerless by the sheer, unyielding force of the twins' silence. The war on communication. The staff attempted to reward them for speaking standard English. A nurse would offer a favourite treat, or 5 minutes of television time, but the twins would refuse, instead communicating their desire to each other in their rapid-fire code, and then presenting a unified, silent front to the staff member. This constant, active rejection of the world's language was their ultimate power play. We can infer that they were masters of passive-aggressive resistance, making every member of staff feel that the therapeutic failure was personal. The impact of medication. The twins were often heavily medicated with major tranquilizers and antipsychotics to manage their extreme mood swings and self-injurious behaviour. The medication, however, had an unintended consequence. It dulled the sharp creative edge that had driven their novels. June's diary entries from this time express a devastating sense of creative loss. They are killing my mind with these pills. I cannot think clearly. I cannot write. The words are gone. This is worse than jail. This is a slow, chemical death of the soul. The medication did suppress the violent external outbursts, but based on this account, it also reinforced the profound stagnation of their internal lives. They were chemically prevented from creating, but the inability to create only intensified the core problem, the deep toxic hatred for the person who was sharing the cage. The prescription pad, meant to heal, became another tool of institutional oppression in their eyes. The staff-patient dynamic. The only way staff could maintain a semblance of order was by accepting the twins' fundamental rules. They must be treated as a unit, and they would not speak the language of the outside world. Any deviation from this rule resulted in immediate synchronized aggression, either against each other or against themselves. The system designed to reform had been entirely co-opted by the pathology it was trying to cure. The entire institution became an unwilling accessory to the folie à deux. It was in this atmosphere of constant psychological stalemate, dulled by years of medication and enforced proximity, that the final terrible pact was made. The twins looked at the high, imposing walls of Broadmoor and realised that the institution could not break them, but it could not free them either. The only way out of the shared cage was a decisive act of self-sovereignty, an ultimate, final act of communication that transcended both silence and speech. Chapter 8, The Unwritten Contract. One Must Die. After 10 years in the highly structured, repressive environment of Broadmoor, the unrelenting internal war between June and Jennifer Gibbons reached a terrifying, logical conclusion. The prolonged, shared isolation, the constant low-level conflict, and the psychological realization that neither could achieve independent life while the other existed, led them to a joint, rational, and chilling decision. One of them must be sacrificed so the other could live. This was the unwritten contract that would define the end of their story. This crucial turning point is not the result of a sudden psychotic break, but the result of years of agonizing self-analysis recorded in their meticulous diaries. The entries from 1990 onwards show a clear shift from angry recrimination to fatalistic acceptance. They had exhausted every means of escape, every avenue for separation. The institutional efforts to cure them by forcing them apart had only proven that the core of their being was a shared one, and that core was fundamentally toxic. They realised with a horrifying clarity that their shared life was a form of mutual psychological death. Their existence was a two-headed snake, and the only way one head could survive was if the other was severed. The diaries reveal the nature of this pact. It was not a suicide pact in the conventional sense, where both agree to die. It was a sacrifice pact, where one twin willingly, or perhaps grudgingly, agreed to give up her life so that the other could be free to speak, to write, and to live independently. The evidence points strongly toward Jennifer being the twin who made the ultimate sacrifice. In her diary, she wrote lines that suggested a deep, resigned fatalism about her role. June's writing, meanwhile, became intensely focused on the future she would have, the books she would write, and the life she would lead alone. The narrative that emerges is that Jennifer, who was often the more dominant and possessive twin, may have realised that her own inability to separate was what was holding June back, and perhaps what was preventing either of them from achieving a peaceful life. The ultimate act of codependency was the decision to dissolve the bond through death. The chilling, internal negotiation over who would die was chronicled by Marjorie Wallace, the journalist. During one of her visits, Jennifer allegedly turned to Wallace and, with a terrifying seriousness, broke her silence to deliver a prophecy. Marjorie, I'm going to die. We've decided. We're coming out and I'm going to die. The statement was delivered without emotion, a simple declaration of a contract that had already been signed in the deep recesses of their shared consciousness. When Wallace pressed her, Jennifer reportedly explained that they had worked out the arrangement. June was the one who was meant to experience life outside, to be the success, the writer. Jennifer would be the sacrifice. The nature of this pact, as recorded later, implies that their folie à deux had inverted its initial purpose. It started as a mechanism for survival against a hostile world. It ended as a mechanism for escape from itself. The intense love and hatred that characterized their relationship had merged into a singular, devastating form of loyalty. The recognition that the ultimate act of love was allowing the other to be free, even at the cost of one's own existence. The staff at Broadmoor, accustomed to the bizarre dynamics of the criminally insane, were still unnerved by this prophecy. They saw no physical signs of illness, no outward distress. Yet the twins, who had been silent for so long, now spoke of death with a calm, rational clarity that defied conventional psychiatric understanding. The context for this pact coincided with the increasing viability of their release. After over a decade in the institution, a combination of legal reviews and psychiatric reports suggested that their destructive behaviour had ceased. They were no longer setting fires, and their relationship, though still deeply intertwined, had become less physically violent. The authorities decided that it was time to transition them to a lower security facility, a necessary step before a conditional release into society. The decision for release, though medically and legally sound, was, in the context of Jennifer's prophecy, an act of supreme dramatic irony. The institution was releasing them with the belief that they were no longer a danger, unaware that the terms of their final contract, the terms of one twin's death, were about to be executed upon leaving the hospital grounds. The long, drawn-out internal war was finally over, and the twin who was designated to die was now preparing to carry out her final, chilling role as the catalyst for her sister's freedom. The silence had now become a quiet, absolute conviction. One of them had to die. Chapter 9. The Prophecy and the Release. The final devastating phase of the silent twin story unfolded with a tragic speed and an eerie, meticulous adherence to the terms of their unwritten contract. By 1993, after more than 11 years at Broadmoor, the psychiatric team finally agreed that the twins had reached a stage where they were no longer a danger to the public. They were scheduled for transfer to a lower security facility, the Caswell Clinic in Bridgend, Wales, a necessary step toward eventual freedom. The day of the transfer, March 9th, 93, was fraught with tension. Staff, though aware of the twins' strange codependent history, were focused on the bureaucratic logistics of the move. Marjorie Wallace, however, the one person privy to the chilling prophecy, watched the proceedings with profound unease. As the transport vehicle prepared to leave Broadmoor, Jennifer Gibbons, the twin who had calmly declared her own impending death, sat in the back seat, strangely subdued. She leaned her head against June's shoulder, a gesture that was both familiar and suddenly weighted with finality. Just before the van pulled away, Jennifer reportedly looked out the window and said to a nurse, "At last we're out." The transfer itself was uneventful for the first part of the journey. Then, a few hours into the drive, something inexplicable occurred. Jennifer suddenly became unresponsive. Her head fell back, and she appeared to have slipped into a deep sleep. June, sitting beside her, was surprisingly calm. The nurses and staff in the vehicle immediately attempted to arouse Jennifer, but she quickly slipped into a coma. The transport was immediately diverted to the nearest hospital, the Princess of Wales Hospital in Bridgend. Jennifer was rushed into the emergency room. Despite the best efforts of the medical team, she could not be revived. Jennifer Gibbons was officially pronounced dead shortly after her arrival at the hospital. She was 29 years old. The medical mystery surrounding her death was immediate and profound. The initial suspicion was poisoning, either accidental or intentional, but the subsequent post-mortem examination was inconclusive. Toxicology reports found no evidence of poison, drugs or alcohol in her system, beyond the regular, low-level therapeutic medication she was taking. There were no signs of physical trauma or struggle. The eventual official cause of death was attributed to acute myocarditis, a sudden severe inflammation of the heart muscle. This diagnosis, while medically plausible, offered no explanation for why a healthy young woman, without any prior symptoms, should suddenly develop fatal heart inflammation at the exact moment of her release from a high-security institution. The medical fact of her death remains a mystery, shrouded in the psychological context of her life. The reaction of June Gibbons was the most chilling confirmation of the pact. At the hospital hours after Jennifer's death, Marjorie Wallace visited June. Wallace found June strangely composed, no tears, no overt hysteria, just a quiet, profound sense of release. June spoke, clearly and coherently, a conversation that stands as one of the most astonishing moments in the entire case. June reportedly told Wallace, "I'm free at last, liberated, and Jennifer has given her life for me. I'm free, and I'm going to live the rest of my life for her." She confirmed the prophecy, the decision, and the sacrifice. She stated that Jennifer had to die so that she, June, could finally speak, think, and exist as an individual. The price of one life was the freedom of the other. The day after Jennifer's death, June was transferred alone to the Caswell Clinic. The most immediate and profound change was the disappearance of the silence. June Gibbons began to speak. She conversed with nurses and doctors, articulate and coherent, speaking the language of the outside world, finally free from the invisible constraints of her sister's possessive codependency. The cryptophasia, the shared language that had been their prison, vanished overnight. This sudden total transformation confirmed the psychological truth that the psychiatric establishment had failed to fully grasp for years. Their pathology was entirely relational. With the removal of the other half of the shared self, the surviving half was instantly liberated. Jennifer's death was not a tragedy that befell them. The sudden onset of this condition, precisely at the moment of freedom, allows us to infer a devastating psychosomatic trigger, suggesting it was the final, devastating, and seemingly self-willed act of their shared existence, the ultimate mechanism for June's survival. The mystery of Jennifer's death, whether a profound psychological mechanism triggered the fatal physiological response, or whether the pact involved a subtle, untraceable self-administration of a substance, remains officially unsolved. What is not speculative is the outcome. June Gibbons was finally truly an individual. The tragic question is whether the justice system or the psychiatric world could have achieved this liberation without the final, irreversible sacrifice. The death of Jennifer Gibbons, the silent twin, stands as the darkest, most profound testament to the power of a shared consciousness, a sacrifice that brought June into the light and ensured that the world would never truly forget the terrible price of their bond. The new life for the surviving twin had begun, a life lived under the shadow of a debt that could never be repaid. Chapter 10. The Aftermath and the Silent Legacy. June Gibbons' life after Jennifer's death and the subsequent release from the Caswell Clinic is, in its own way, as compelling and mysterious as her life in silence. She was finally truly alone, the singular identity that her teenage self had yearned for in the privacy of her diary. Her existence became a living testament to the chilling contract forged in the isolation of Broadmoor. The price of her freedom was a soul-shattering one, but the freedom itself was real and immediate. The most striking change was, of course, the ability to speak. June, who had communicated only in whispers and private code for 2 decades, began to converse fluently with the outside world. The high-pitched, sing-song cryptophasia that had baffled doctors vanished. She began to speak with a normal cadence and rhythm, articulating her thoughts and feelings with a clarity that was both startling and heartbreaking. She was finally able to engage in simple, everyday interactions that had been impossible for the shared entity. After a period of transition in the lower security clinic, June was granted a conditional discharge and moved into supported housing near the family home in Haverfordwest. Her integration into society was slow but steady. She was eventually able to secure a small independent flat. She began to live the life of a quiet, working adult, maintaining a low profile but remaining in contact with her family and with Marjorie Wallace. The freedom June found was dedicated, as she had promised, to her sister's legacy. She maintained a quiet, lifelong devotion to Jennifer's memory. Most crucially, she fulfilled the literary aspect of their shared dream. June continued to write, though she often channeled her energy into poetry and short personal reflections, rather than the sprawling, dark novels of her youth. She was finally able to publish some of their combined work, including the novel The Pepsi Cola Addict, fulfilling the pact to achieve some measure of literary recognition. This achievement was, for June, a way of honouring the sacrifice, a quiet declaration that Jennifer's death had not been in vain. The legal and ethical questions raised by the Gibbons case, however, endure and form the critical legacy of their story. The ethics of indefinite detention. Was the indeterminate sentence in a maximum security hospital, designed for the criminally insane, an appropriate response to a profound case of folie à deux? Critics argue that the severity of the institutional environment only exacerbated the twins' condition, deepening their isolation and internal conflict. The system, unable to understand a new form of psychological distress, chose to lock it away indefinitely. The role of society and environment. The case highlights the devastating impact of severe social isolation and racism on already vulnerable individuals. The twins' initial withdrawal was a reaction to a hostile environment. Their later criminal acts were less about malice and more about a desperate, self-destructive cry for help. The failure of the school system, the social service network, and the early psychiatric interventions to break their bond gently is a profound mark against the institutions meant to protect them. The mystery of shared consciousness. The Gibbons case remains one of the most documented and extreme examples of codependency in identical twins. Their ability to form a secret language, their synchronous movement, and the sheer power of their psychological contract to execute a sacrifice pact challenge fundamental notions of selfhood and free will. The power of their shared will was so potent that it begs the question of whether a profound psychological mechanism triggered the final fatal physiological response. This question may never be answered, cementing the Gibbons twins' story as an enduring psychological mystery. June Gibbons, now living a private, individual life, carried the quiet burden of her sister's sacrifice. She had achieved the separation she craved, but the cost was a permanent state of grief and quiet reflection. She was no longer a silent twin, but she was a survivor of a psychological war that demanded a life. Her journey is a profound meditation on the terrifying boundary between the self and the other, the dark side of twinship, and the ultimate fatal price of freedom. The story of the silent twins is not a neatly solved case. There is no triumphant resolution, only a quiet, unnerving end to a profound human tragedy. It is a mystery that asks us to look closely at the walls we build around ourselves, the silent pacts we make, and the immense, frightening power of the human will, even the will to die for the survival of another. The silent twins found their voice only in death, and the legacy of Jennifer's final silent act continues to speak volumes about the fragility of identity and the terrible solitude of the human mind. You've just learned how two girls try to escape a confusing world by building a perfect prison of two, and how one had to die for the other to finally be free. If you want to explore another mystery, subscribe and comment what cases you want to learn about.